Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Luke from Astro Awakening, and you are watching part 2 of the video, Are we on the cusp of another 9/11? The astrology of the end of an age. So in my first video, we looked at some of the big themes around the symbolism and the changing of the age. We took a brief look at the actual astrology of November the 8th. So for those outside of Australia, we refer to the date first, so 8th of November, we would say. So it would be for us 8/11. Even though September 11 was actually for us 11th of the 9th or 11th of September, because 9/11 is the name sort of that most people associate September 11th with, we refer to it as 9/11. But when I refer to a date, normally in Australia, my birthday, for example, is the 25th of August. I don't say it's August 25th. That's just how we say it in Australia. So there were some people that were confused by me saying 9/11, 8/11, and you were thinking that it was going to be, August the 11th. But no, I'm referring to November the 8th. So the 11th month, 8th day of the 11th month. So from here on in, I'm going to refer to November the 8th for my international guests as 8/11. Okay. If that confuses you, then you're missing the point of these videos because we don't want to get caught up in semantics. You got to look at the big picture. So again, I'm going to illustrate some of the symbolism associated to the astrological alignments. And this video is going to focus on the birth chart of Australia. I'm going to do a part 3, and that part 3 will look at the birth chart of America. Obviously, the United States is a bit of a beacon for democracy and freedom, for the Western world. And they're obviously at the peak of massive changes with their election only around the corner. Or is there going to be an election? So their birth chart is ultra active around this time also. To get into this video, first we have to establish which birth chart of Australia we're going to use. And like I stated in my last video, if you haven't looked at that video yet, I encourage you to go into my history and look at the last video I put up. Make sure you're up to date on that. But I suggested that, there's lots of different birth charts we can cast for a country. We don't have the beginning of the country in the sense of like Australia as a land or a continent existed long before white settlement, long before colonization, long before Aboriginal people were even on this land. There would have been a land here. So, are we looking at birth chart of the actual land? No, we're looking at a birth chart of the identity of Australia as we know it in this modern time. And one could argue, when does that begin? So when I was doing research on this particular video, I found 3 different birth charts that we could look at for Australia. So then what I did was I looked at those 3 birth charts in relation to historical events. Because when there's been significant national historical events, they will be active via direction, transit, progression in the natal chart of that country. And what I found was when I went back in 1951, 1942, 1983, 2009, natural disasters, bushfires. I looked at the invasion that we had when Japanese invaded Darwin or attacked Darwin. I looked at when there was a massive volcano in 1951 in part of PNG, which at the time was part of Australia. So when I've checked the birth charts, the 3 different birth charts, one particular birth chart sort of resonates the best, and that's the birth chart I'm choosing to use. So the 3 different birth charts, we have one which is on the arrival of Captain Cook and the shores of Botany Bay in Sydney. And there is obviously a little bit of debate as to exactly what the timing of that chart was. Ed Tamplin, who was an Australian astrologer who's since passed away a couple of years ago for cancer. He was a fantastic mundane astrologer, and miss his work immensely, especially around these times, because it's far more advanced than I could ever be. And as a side note, this isn't my work. My work is helping people that are going through an awakening journey and helping them transitioning from their old life, their old version of self, into their new, more aligned version, to do the work of self-transformation, self-actualization, and to step onto their spiritual path. So that's what I help people do. This stuff that I'm putting up in relation to 8/11 and this video series is just because I've been asked countless times by countless people from different points of view around my perspective on this. So as I started to look into the astrology of this particular event or date, it was pretty overwhelming. So I thought, well, there's compelling evidence here to put forth a case, put the information out there. It obviously is going to sort of complement a lot of the symbolism stuff that's going around. I know Annette from the White Pill and Dee, like I mentioned in my last video, are doing a lot of work there. And obviously a lot more people are now sort of being exposed to it. So again, this video, me, in my perspective, is not necessarily telling you what you should or shouldn't be doing. You need to take the information and, you know, the symbolism, and you need to use discernment and do what is right for you and your loved ones and your family. I hope and pray that this date comes and goes and nothing really significant happens. I'd be very surprised if that is the case, but it's not that I'm a doomsdayist or an anarchist or anything like that. But when we have certain major astrological alignments and where they then activate or impact on a natal chart or a birth chart, whether it's a person or a country in this case, you'd expect that there would be some sort of experience, event, or life circumstances that the person or the country is going to go through. So that's the purpose of this video. So the other video that the other chart that I found was a chart located for Melbourne, because at the time of the Commonwealth, Australia becoming the Commonwealth, 1901, it was actually something that occurred in England. You know, they sort of gave the tick. And there's a chart created for Melbourne at 12 a.m. in the morning. But I sort of looked at that chart and thought, well, that doesn't really correlate to a significant event. That's just a moment in time. So the chart that I've chosen to use is the chart for Sydney, 1901. And this is the swearing in of the first Prime Minister. So you could sort of say, even if we were sort of given the tick to become country or a Commonwealth, you know, it wasn't really official until we had the first head of state, you know, elected. So the swearing in of the first Prime Minister of Australia, 1901, that's the chart that I'm using. It also lines up with Sydney, and that's the area in which this actual event did occur, was something that did happen and wasn't just like a tick on a piece of paper. And when I've tested this particular chart, like I said, going back in a lot of the historical events, there's a lot of evidence to support that this chart sort of works in this context. So then, you know, the argument is, well, what does this represent? This chart represents the identity of the country, the people, how it's governed, their values, resources, how they use it, their foreign relations. All of those things can be looked at, just like we look at a birth chart and we're looking at all the different aspects of the individual. When we look at a country's chart, we're looking at all the different aspects of the country as a whole. So symbolically, there's not a lot of difference. So the first thing I want to look at here in the birth chart of Australia is the angles of this particular birth chart. This is for the 1st of January 1901 at 1:35 p.m. in Sydney, Australia. And this is when Australia sort of became a federation with the swearing in of the first Prime Minister. And at that particular moment in time, on the ascendant was Aries at the 29th degree, the anaretic degree of Aries. So that's going to be significant to look at. What the ascendant represents is the sort of predisposition of the people of the country. Okay, so what type of people are we can be depicted by this area. And then also we have the moon in Taurus, you know, so security, material security with Taurus is super important, you know, for Australians. So, you know, you could sort of say that the Australian dream is about home ownership. And, you know, the great Australian dream is to own the white picket fence and the home. And that's sort of embedded within the psyche of the people. And that gives us a level of comfort, right, with the moon in the first house. So that's the rising sign and that particular degree. Opposite here, when we come to our foreign relationships and our relationships with other countries in particular, we have Libra sitting on the other cusp. The other thing you'll notice about this particular chart is that there is a big stellium in Sagittarius, even though our country is, the identity of the country is Capricorn in the 9th house. We're hardworking. We're a very ambitious country, but we're also known as, with Jupiter in its own sign of Sagittarius, we're known as the lucky country. Okay, but you know, Mercury is opposite Neptune. We're super idealistic. but we're also being deceived through finances and taxes. So we're one of the most heavily taxed countries in the world, no doubt, because they'll use it like we're the lucky country and you've got to pay your fair share, and they've sort of impacted on our ideology and how we see things in relation to that's something that's good for us. It's just, and if you look at it like here with regards to the moon in Taurus, it's like that need for financial or material security. It's like, yeah, well, you've got to pay your taxes, so there's no, we have, Jupiter in Sag with a conjunction with Uranus in our eighth house of taxes. And there is no limit to the amount of different taxes, tariffs, fees, registrations, like you've got no idea. I think recently Tucker Carlson came to Australia and he was like, "What are you guys doing? How do you live here? How do you afford to live here?" It's like, yeah, how do you afford to live in Australia? But then the argument, right, is like, oh, but we're the lucky country, and it's like, yeah, okay, we're sort of under a little bit of delusionment there. Absolutely, Neptune in opposition to Mercury for sure. So up here on our MC, the other angle, we have 2 degrees of Aquarius. This is our government, but also this is our sort of public reputation to the world at large. And then down here, this is our home and our real estate. So this is the bottom part of the chart. Now, this is our domestic sort of part of life. And you could see that, again, home ownership with Leo on the cusp of the 4th house of Australia. Home ownership is a sense of pride that we take in that. So, maybe possibly to our own detriment in a way. So that's a little bit about a chart. So when you're looking at any particular chart, the angles are the most sensitive part of a chart, followed by probably what we would call the personal planets. If you're looking at an individual, looking at the personal planets, that's the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. And then we get into the sort of transpersonal planets, which is Saturn and Jupiter, law and order. And then we get into the generational and transformational, which is the Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So that's just a little bit of what we're looking at a chart. And then I want to look at the directed arcs, solar arcs of the planets. So there are a lot of different charts, timing charts, techniques that we can use to take this birth chart, because when we look here, we're looking at the potential of the energetics of this country from 1st of Jan 1901. And we want to take that out of 1901 and move it into 2024. So, as we do, what we do is we do a technique, as I suggested in my last video, which is called a directed solar arc. And out of all the different timing techniques, that tends to show up the best for cases of activation of particular energies, and then the likelihood of an experience or event or something that you're going to go through. We can do it for an individual, and we can also do it for a country. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the directed solar arcs for Australia, and I'm going to move it into the 8th of November, or for my foreigners, 11/8. As you would say, but we're going to say 8/11. We'll put it at 11 a.m. As you saw in my last video, when we looked at the astrocartography for 11 a.m. in Sydney, it was the exact alignment of the Mars-Pluto opposition with the moon triggering it. And it runs right across the top of Sydney. So I found that very interesting. So we're going to sort of look at all of the different planets here and through their arcs and what that could possibly mean. So we'll start, I like to start with the outer planets and then move in. Because the outer planets, when they impact us via direction, progression, or transit, they tend to signify some pretty transformational experiences that we're going to go through. When we're looking at Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, we're dealing with transformational type energies that first sort of impact us from the unconscious. And you could say that significant events, because of the slow-moving nature of these planets and because of what they represent, they all often tie into significant events in our life. If you've ever been through a Pluto transit to your ascendant or across one of your sun or your moon, you can betcha that that's going to be a massive time of upheaval or crisis or change and transformation, and almost like a death and a rebirth. And you can look back in your life if you've experienced something like that and retrospectively go back into your birth chart and go, well, what was happening at that time? And you'll see the influence usually of an outer planet impacting your natal chart in some way. So what I want to do is just look at Pluto, because Pluto is the furthest planet. Pluto deals in transformation through crisis, death, rebirth. It's like the phoenix moment. Everything has to be brought down so that some truth can emerge. And often what happens is something that's been deeply hidden, obscured, and unconscious can come into light. So Pluto is currently up into the sixth house. The sixth house of a country is going to represent the health of the country and impact, in particular, the types of illnesses that are going on. So Pluto in there is moving into a quincunx to the natal moon of Australia. I found that very significant. You could sort of say that this is going to sort of relate to a bit of an adjustment period that could come through some type of crisis of security or stability or even emotions. So when the Pluto, the directed Pluto quincunxes the moon, there is a massive transformational, potent change in the emotional security on the predisposition first house of the people. You could say it's a crisis of security. So that's happening now. Its peak is probably in a little while, but we're well within the orb of influence. If you're wondering what the orb of influence is for a direction, so imagine a bell curve like this. And let's say that there are 3 points along that bell curve. We have a beginning, we have a middle, and we have an end. Okay, so this is always usually the peak of the energy. And we sort of start and we move into this peak and then we sort of wane out of it. It's a little bit like, there's a new moon, right? That's the full moon, and then that's the next new moon. So this phase or cycle, when it comes to a direction, is going to span, 12 to 18 months from this beginning to the end. So with the Pluto quincunx the moon, we're probably about here. Not quite at the peak, but we're close to the peak of this energy. Okay, so bear that in mind, whether we're at a peak of this or whether we're at the beginning or an end. It sort of helps us to sort of say, well, we're likely to experience the intensity of that energy the closer we are to the peak of that bell curve. So that's Pluto quincunx the moon. Next, we have Neptune. And Neptune is just past the descendant degree. So it's at 1 degree of Scorpio in the seventh house. Seventh house is foreign relationships. And what's happening is Neptune is now moving into a square to our MC and our IC. And you could say this is domestic and this is our foreign reputation or public reputation to the world stage. And this is our, home soil. Our relationships are going through a little bit of disillusion and even confusion when it comes to our foreign relationships in relation to what's good for the country, our home and domestic affairs in relation to our foreign affairs and our public reputation. This is also relating to the government that is not in power, so the political opponent, and then this would be the government that's in power at the moment. And there is a lot of disillusionment going on. And I could think that probably as someone looking in from out to the outside, looking at Australia, are probably thinking, what is going on in that country? I know for a lot of us in this country, it's what is going on? We have Anthony Albanese. We have AA, first letter of the alphabet. There's that 11. We have Anthony Albanese at the helm at the moment. And look, Anthony Albanese is clear to see that this AA character is not necessarily calling the shots in any way. If you've ever watched him in his public speaking, he's a bit of a clown. He's very awkward. And he's someone like you look and think, look at this nation of bright people, amazing fucking people live in this country, the lucky country. And this is the person that we put in charge. Come on now. You know why that is the case? Because all of the people that have half a brain are like There's no way we want to be involved in that. There is corruption at the highest level. There's a group and a gang of people that are operating from the shadows that sort of put up the next clown. They elect these morons to sort of be the public face of their, deceptive sort of politics. So this is an interesting period of time. And certainly when you think about our foreign relationships, they're probably looking in going, what the hell is going on? The other thing you could suggest about Anthony Albanese, this AA boy, is he's very weak. If we put that AA upside down, we get W. And we've got a little weak man, very, very weak man. But that's also a little frightening to have someone such as him running the country, or at least the figurehead, if we look at that, because there is absolutely no way that he's running the country. Uranus is out of orb. So if we're looking at Uranus sextile Pluto, we're sort of looking at this alignment, and Uranus at 18 degrees and 3 minutes. Excuse me, Pluto at 16 degrees, 15 minutes. You've got probably this alignment, this sextile. So the 12th house is going to be hidden enemies. Okay, this is our open enemies in our 7th house. Our 12th house is hidden enemies. But have you got some sort of unexpected potential attack on our resources or our energy or the power that we have as a country? The Uranus sextile to Pluto is probably about here somewhere. So it's out of that main alignment. And it's when we get to this part of the alignment, we're losing power. From here up, we're gaining power. So the intensity tends to, wax to that point. It builds up with intensity to get to this usual release point. We're past that and we're now on the other side. The sextile is not a major alignment in context to a direction, but there is a connection, albeit very small. Saturn's the next planet we're going to look at, and Saturn is in trine from the 1st house to the sun and also to natal Mars. So there is a trine like that. Saturn is in Taurus in our 1st house via direction. It's trining the sun, and it's also trining the Mars. The sun and Mars are in Virgo and Capricorn. So there's Earth, Earth, Earth. We have this trine. We have some structural changes here to the way in which we're governed, to the identity of the country, and to the way in which we utilize our energy. So there's a whatever's going on along this time. This is a time to us to look really seriously as a people of how we are governed. How do we want to? What is the identity of the country? How do we utilize our energy? And also with regards to our youth, right? So how do we lay down some groundwork for the future generations, that 5th house of our children. So that's an interesting thing. It's not a major alignment. What I want you to keep in mind when we're looking at these directions is I want you to look at them in context to the transits that I'm going to show you shortly. And the transits, which are happening for us collectively across the entire Earth, they tend to be triggers or activators of the energy that's sort of built up within these directions. So one of the major directions that I think is probably the most impactful to change of Australia at the moment is Jupiter has reached the 29th degree of Aries, which it's put it in direct conjunction with the ascendant, with the people, with the identity, with the predisposition. Right. So this is sort of how we as a people express our energy. And this is how we as a nation are perceived by other nations. This is our actual direct one-to-one relationships with other countries. And this is our home down here. So Jupiter, being that Jupiter is, in its domicile in Sagittarius, Jupiter is, we're known as the lucky country. We've got that very optimistic outlook. So when Jupiter via direction has come into the 29th degree of Aries and conjunct our ascendant, we're into some big changes in relation to that sort of belief of our country, our ideals, our beliefs. Are we going to be seen, our identity? Now, the other thing that I want you to understand, especially via direction, when a planet reaches the 29th degree, that's said to be a degree of crisis. It's the anaretic degree, and that can be encapsulated in this is that all of the energy of the last 30 years can come to a culmination point. And we've had Jupiter moving through the 12th house in Aries. Aries is a sign of like aggression and conflict, ruled by Mars, the god of war. And we've got Jupiter now, which is a planet of expansion, right, and growth and more of things. So we've got this major shift to the uh, national identity of this country. And through that 29th degree, we can often see those shifts taking place through some type of crisis. So that particular degree there of Jupiter at direction on the ascendant of the country, I want you to remember that when we're looking at the transits and what's being activated via that particular one. So national pride, our ideals, our beliefs as a country and our identity are set for major shifts and changes. And Jupiter has only got, so if we look again at the bell curve, we're probably looking at this alignment with Jupiter as it's about here. So it's past the peak, but we're still within this major orb of influence. And, what I would look for if I was looking at a natal chart, what I would look for if that direction was occurring and impacting on someone's chart is I'd look for a transit that potentially triggered that. So a transit to it or via square or opposition to that particular point would be how I would go along that bell curve. And let's say that we're here with this direction. But if I saw that, at this point, there was going to be a major transit activating that particular quality, I would say that that could be the timing of whatever this particular energy represents. A major shift to the identity of Australia. Mars is an interesting planet to look at through directions, and especially to Australia's chart. Now, Mars has moved in through the 9th house. It's at 15 degrees of Capricorn, and it's within orb now of a quincunx to Pluto. And Mars and Pluto don't tend to, play nicely together. We've got conflict, aggression, we've got war, we've got attacks, we've got violence, we've got accidents. And we've got them playing out in a major way, a very powerful way, a transformative way. So the quincunx is 150 degree, it's a separation. And again, there's a period of a major adjustment. And a major adjustment with Mars could be coming through some potential conflict, okay, or attack. Now, if we go back to 1996, Mars via direction was about here, okay? So we got this little Mars here in 1996, and it was directly opposite Pluto in opposition. And in 1996, what changed the power dynamics in relation to violence, murder, and the transformation of our values, second house, as a country? Well, in 1996, when Mars was in direct opposition to Pluto, we had the Port Arthur massacre. So that was the biggest single event in Australia from a mass murder perspective. And at the time, I think it was the biggest mass murder event in the world occurring in Tasmania, Australia. Now, that event transformed national values, resources in a major way through a violent attack, a murder, mass murder. Martin Bryant was the fall guy they used to pin that particular event on. And what happened as a result was they took the guns from the people. It was massive national gun reform. So looking at the pairing of Mars and Pluto often will, impact on some pretty major events in relation to violence, attacks, murder. And when we're dealing with Pluto, we want to amplify that onto like a mass level. Okay, so huge impact, and it's very transformational. So Mars quincunx, the quincunx is an aspect of adjustment. That adjustment with these two planets can come through crisis. And adjustment, we're looking at this natal Mars and what that represents, an adjustment to the energy of the people and our resources and how to utilize those energy to the future generations, to the way in which we work as a country and our values, what motivates us, our drives and desires. So there's a bit of an adjustment coming up in relation to that. Venus our diplomacy, our relationships, and our values as a country, as well as economically. We want to look at Venus. She's the ruler of our second house through Taurus. So, the nation's economic situation can be looked at tracking Venus and her directions, progressions, and transits. She's at 14 degrees of Aries in that 12th house, the 12th house of endings and undoings and karmic changes. Venus is in direct trine to natal Uranus in the eighth house. I want to also stress that the eighth house is the death rate of the country, and the sixth house is the illness of the country. So, and amongst other things. So, what I would suggest with Venus in trine to Uranus is a pretty sudden shift and change in the values of the country, the resources of the country, and the economic status or situation of the country. So that's, again, it's not a major direction, but it is there through this particular period of time. The directed solar arc of the sun, which represents, our intrinsic sort of goals, aspirations, and our nature, a little bit of our identity also. We're sort of seen as very hardworking. We've got the sun natally in Capricorn. So it's coming around, it's quincunxing Neptune. It's sesqui-square to both Mercury and Chiron, and it's semi-square to Neptune. So there is an adjustment to our identity, our goals and visions as a country. There's a little bit of friction and agitation with regards to like, how do we articulate that? How do we communicate that? And there is a need to change the way we see ourselves, and we see ourselves in relation to other countries. We've also got this sesqui-square to Chiron, so you could say that we're going through a period of healing as a nation, and that healing can come through an event that could potentially be hurtful. And then the semi-square to Neptune is this period of adjustment is creating a little bit of confusion with our identity, our goals, and our future aspirations as a nation. So where do we stand? Where do we stand as a country? Where do we stand on the world stage? Where we've got political puppets in control with a corrupted media at the moment that tend to think that's good for us as a country that stand alone down here in the Southern Hemisphere to be supporting this sort of rogue, idea of how do we support these other nations that are at conflict? Do we even as a people agree with the way in which our media and our politicians are directing us with our foreign affairs and foreign relationships? I would say that there's probably a lot of people that say no, and there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of manipulation going on as well. So it's a time of confusion. We don't know where we stand. There's a little agitation and friction in the sense of like, there's a potential for conflict and argumentation around these ideals, around our future, around our foreign policy. So it's an interesting period of time in Australia's history. The final planet we want to look at is Mercury, and Mercury, again, with regards to communication and how we see ourselves and communicate and articulate our ideals, our media as well. And that planet is coming into a square to the IC and the MC. So our domestic affairs, our home policies versus our public affairs and our, foreign policies, and where do we stand as a nation. So Mercury coming into a square to that, and there's going to be a shift in our perception as a nation in relation to our home and domestic as well as our foreign relationships and affairs. So let's take a look now at the transits laid over the top of all of this. So what we've been looking at is the birth chart of Australia, and then we're looking at the cycles of change in relation to us as a nation and the different aspects of us and how and the way in which we're changing. The birth chart holds the potential, the directions sort of allow us for that potential to play out, and where there's significant alignments or degrees met and things like that, it can relate to significant changes either in the individual or the collective, as we're seeing. So when we look at the transits, this is what's cosmically happening for everyone at the same time. So we are going to have around the 3rd of November an exact opposition between Mars and Pluto from Cancer to Capricorn. Now, everyone on Earth will experience that opposition. It's just going to impact everyone differently depending on their own particular natal chart. So when we look at that in context to Australia's birth chart, we're sort of saying, well, this sort of energetic sort of path that we're moving through impacts us and our energies and our frequencies and activates things. So it activates the potential. So a transit on its own can sometimes not mean much. Maybe something's going on in your life or around or outside you. But usually what a transit is a trigger or an activation of the latent potential that's already there based on the birth chart of the person. In other words, based on their individuality and their life experience, their life path, what they're karmically moving through as types of experiences that are going to help them change, grow, and evolve as a person, or change, grow, and evolve as a country. So the transits in themselves can't be looked at as like just alone. We've got to look them in context to these other things. So I've been building the case study here for you guys so you can get the big picture, okay, of how what's happening for us as a country and our potential is evolving and how it's evolving and changing, and then the transits are these activations of that. So we need to keep that in mind when we take a look at this next chart. The main show and activated by the transiting moon. Think of the moon, the minute hand of the clock, right? It sort of activates the precise moment of something. The moon is the little trigger. The moon intrinsically on its own doesn't necessarily hold any significance of manifestation unless the natal moon itself is being triggered or activated, right? So the transiting moon, look at it as just a shift in energy, and that energy as it's shifting, it's sort of almost like it's bringing things, it's activating or triggering them, but it's only ever going to activate or trigger the potential that it's already there. So on the 8th of November at 11 a.m. in Sydney, we have the moon moving into 0 degrees of Aquarius. It's going to be in direct conjunction with Pluto, and even though Pluto is in Capricorn, you have the two in the same within a degree of the zodiac. So again, we look at the moon conjunct Pluto, okay, and the moon conjunct Pluto would be a 3-hour transit. So from the start to the end is about 3 hours. With the moon moving into Aquarius, we've probably got it at this point of that particular alignment. So well within the peak period of a trigger for what Pluto is happening or what's happening to Pluto. The other thing that's happening when the moon enters into Aquarius, it's going to directly oppose Mars. And opposition becomes a defining moment. It's a turning point. You know, when there's one, it's like the old Mexican standoff. You're one against the other. So the moon coming into an opposition to that Mars, it's going to activate Mars, and what Mars is triggering or representing. Mars is in direct opposition to Pluto. So Mars-Pluto oppositions happen every 2 or so years, depending on the Mars cycle. And like I stated in an earlier video, we're going to have 3 oppositions from Mars and Pluto from November, December, and April in 2025. And the reason for that is because Mars is slowing down to stop at 6 degrees of Leo. And on the 7th of December at 6 degrees of Leo, Mars will retrograding back to the 17th degree of Cancer, stopping at 24th of February, and then moving forward and passing the 6th degree of Leo by May next year. So this little part of the sky, which encompasses 17 degrees Cancer through to 6 degrees of Leo, is going to have Mars there for 6 months. And that is on Australia's birth chart, directly conjunct the home, the heart. Leo, the heart of the nation, the home of the nation. And Mars deals with accidents and attacks. And Mars in opposition to Pluto, we could see there is a level of chaos, crisis, or extreme nature to what this opposition is going to represent. Now, the thing that really sort of stood out to me when I looked at all of this is that opposition triggered by the moon on the 8th, exactly on the 8th at 11 a.m., triggered by that transiting moon, is directly square to the ascendant and Jupiter at 29 degrees of Aries. So that opposition on its own, the Mars-Pluto opposition is a powerful moment of conflict that moves us towards, you know, irrevocable transformation, the death and rebirth, a crisis moment. Something comes to a head for a shift to take place. When Mars and Pluto, Mars, the higher octave of the lower octave of Pluto, we're dealing with aggression and conflict. Here we're dealing with like rage and violence on a mass scale. Okay, so that pairing, again, via transit, if not activating something, it might not be significant for the nation or for the individual. But when it's on the IC and the MC, this is the home of the nation. This is the public reputation. And this is the identity of the nation, right? Of the people. Jupiter, we're a Jupiterian country. We're the lucky country. Okay. And, that Jupiter, 29 degrees of Aries on conjunction with the ascendant. To give you an example, right, it would take 360 years for Jupiter to come back to that particular point. It has taken since 1901, Jupiter was here. It's taken since 1901. So it's 123 years for Jupiter to come around to this point. The angle and the ascendant of any chart, whether it's your chart or a nation's chart, is probably the most sensitive point in the entire birth chart. Okay, it's the most sensitive point. Jupiter dealing with huge, expansive type experiences that, amplify things. There is a shift on a major level of the identity of this nation, and especially when it comes to our home and our public image. And that Jupiter on our ascendant via direction is directly triggered by the Mars-Pluto opposition, activated on the 8th by the moon coming across as a trigger point right at 11 a.m. And if you remember my last video at the end where I showed you the astrocartography for the Pluto-Mars opposition with the moon and how it runs directly over Sydney, Australia, this is a pretty significant moment. Now, that moon carries forth the energy of the new moon that happened about a week earlier from this moment. And that new moon occurred in the sign of Scorpio. And Scorpio is a sign ruled by Mars and Pluto. So when you have Mars and Pluto in opposition and a Scorpio new moon, that new moon cycle, right, from new moon to full moon to new moon, that is a massive, powerful lunation. People talk about supermoons and there's these blood moons and supermoons and blue moons, and this moon, this Scorpio new moon, and what it carries forth as an energetic to unfold through the lunation, getting towards the full moon point, which will be a full moon in Taurus, the exaltation of that moon. That's a potent new moon cycle, because the two planets that have rulership over that sign are at war with one another. There is a conflict here. So that conflict is coming to a crisis point because the moon is going to carry forth that energy and trigger their opposition. As it does so, it'll activate the natal ascendant and directed solar arc Jupiter, which is at the anaretic critical degree, the degree of crisis, as it hits the ascendant of Australia. This is a pretty significant point. Now, what else is being activated by transit at this particular moment? There is a Neptune square Neptune. Now, most people have their Neptune square Neptune around their late 30s and early 40s. And if you hadn't already, through some other experience, spiritually activated at that, prior to your Neptune square Neptune, Neptune square Neptune often relates to an awakening of higher consciousness. So people can go through an awakening moment with Neptune square Neptune. Is our country going to, through a crisis, a moment of crisis, go through a mass awakening? Now, with everything, there isn't one thing. There's a multitude of things when we're looking at the symbolism. And what we can also expect is a mass confusion, mass hysteria, mass overwhelm, where we don't know what's real and what isn't real in a minute, what's going on. So the Neptune square Neptune via transit is a pretty significant activation of our Neptune. Neptune in our natal chart of a country is opposite Mercury. And we can go from idealism into delusionment or into complete panic and pandemonium in a heartbeat. We also have Uranus quincunxing natal Jupiter, precisely There's a quincunx. When there's a quincunx, there is a major adjustment. This can come through Uranian sudden upheaval, right? And to Jupiter, to our ideals, right? And Jupiter is embedded into the psyche of this country because we're optimistic. We have a good, strong belief. She'll be right, country. We're the lucky country. There is going to be a Uranian adjustment, so a sudden rebellious disruption to that around this time. And Jupiter has out of bounds Venus directly on it. Out of bounds Venus, rogue Venus, love and our idea of love and the heart and relationship. It's almost like there is an attack directly on that. There's more. There's more. So we have transiting Saturn in direct opposition to natal Mars. And natal Mars, amongst other things, can represent the military of a country. So we've got this sort of restriction, this blockage, this control, this limitation. It's almost like Mars is our energy of drive and ambition coming into a full sort of stop. It's like something is happening to cause this sort of like hit the brakes. Jupiter, the planet of expansion, so amplifying energy. Think of Jupiter as amplification. Jupiter is at 19 degrees Gemini, retrograding in the second house, moving into a conjunction to Pluto. So Jupiter transit to the natal Pluto, you could expect it amplifies what that Pluto represents, transformation through crisis. Lastly, I want to focus on the Sun in Scorpio of foreign relations and open enemies. Scorpio, the sign of death. And we've got it at 16 degrees, and you have our natal Pluto at 16 degrees. So there's a quincunx. Again, there is a period of adjustment, but the 16 degrees at this moment, when planets share a degree, irrespective of their actual relationship or aspect, when there is a degree, there is an activation. So anything at 16 degrees of any sign is sort of reverberating with the quality of that sun, and that sun is coming off the new moon in Scorpio. Okay, so it's sort of holding a lot of that potential, transformation, death, and rebirth change that Scorpio has associated with it. One final thing I'm going to do with the Australia birth chart is I'm just going to look at the secondary progressions. So secondary progressions are, again, another timing technique, and they just add a little bit of more information for us. We don't tend to focus too much on the outer planets through progression because they move so slowly. I'm not going to go into the details of why that is the case, but just know that they move very slowly, so we don't consider them too much. One thing that stood out to me was that the progressed moon, we've just been through a full moon phase, and we're actually still in the full moon phase. So the full moon in a progression is a culminating point. It's a bit of a turning point. It's almost right to reach the peak. Now we're on the sort of waning side of that full moon phase. That full moon is a culmination of the last 15 years, and it's part of a 30-year cycle. So it's a halfway point along that period of time. That full moon now has reached Scorpio, and on the 8th, it'll be at 27 degrees of Scorpio in the 7th house, foreign relations, open enemies, and it'll be making a quincunx directly to Neptune. So there's a trigger again of what that Neptune is. They're a mass event that connects us on a huge level. So, and that triggering of that moon to that Neptune activates all of the other alignments that Neptune have, whether it's via direction or via transit. So it brings this level of hysteria and confusion and not knowing what's real and what isn't real. So you could say that when that happens, people can panic, literally can panic. They're the energetics of Australia's birth chart in relation to 8/11. Now, because of the symbolism that's been decoded and what it suggests, if there were no signatures astrologically that supported the symbolism, then I would say that the symbolism is nothing more than propaganda or paranoia. But if the symbolism supports that potentially there could be some type of cataclysmic event occurring in Sydney, Australia, or along the eastern seaboard of Australia, And then the astrology of the birth chart of Australia and of what's happening for us collectively, consciously, karmically, and via transit all trigger and activate sensitive parts within that chart and geographically, then you can put that together yourself and what that might mean for you. I'm going to explore this a little deeper. I know this video is quite long, so bear with me, and there's going to be another follow-up part 3. But what I want to look at now in particular is the bridge, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And the bridge has a birth chart. And why I'm going to look at the bridge is because there was a solar eclipse just a little while ago at 10 degrees of Libra, and Libra is the bridge. Literally, the sign Libra looks like a bridge. You'll see here, we have a look at Libra, now look at the bridge. And there is a connection between the two. And what does that represent? But a break in relationships, a break in harmony, a change in from the past to the future, a bit of a moment of change.